He said it before the bell rang. Not loudly, not to a crowd, just to a reporter holding a notepad outside the gym in Miami, sweat still cooling on his shoulders, hands wrapped in tape he hadn't bothered to remove. The question was routine. The answer was not. He looked straight ahead and said he would win. Not that he thought he might. Not that he hoped at that he would. The reporter wrote it down without looking up. At 20 years old, Cassius Clay had already learned how to move inside a ring. He understood angles, timing, the mathematics of distance, the way a jab could measure space before a cross arrived, the way footwork could make a bigger man miss by inches that felt like miles. But what he had begun to understand outside the ring was different. Winning wasn't enough. Winning quietly meant disappearing the moment the decision was read. He had watched it happen to others. Good fighters, skilled fighters, men who could box but couldn't make people remember their names past the parking lot. So he started speaking. It began small. A sentence here, a casual prediction there. Nothing theatrical. No poetry. No round counts. Just certainty delivered in a voice that didn't waver. I think I'll win. Then, a week later, I'm going to win. Reporters weren't sure what to do with it. Confidence was expected in fighters. This was something else. This was a man drawing a line in public and daring himself not to cross back over it. Some wrote it down as color. Local interest, a young fighter with personality. Others heard something sharper beneath it. A challenge that wasn't aimed at opponents. It was aimed at himself. Miami in those months felt tight. The gyms were small, the air thick with salt and sweat. The sparring partners rotated through like shifts at a factory. Morning sessions started before the sun burned off the humidity. Evening sessions ended when the lights in the building went dark. Clay trained under Angelo Dundee, who watched everything and said less than most assumed. Dundee had seen plenty of young fighters with fast hands. He had seen fewer with fast mouths, and he knew what that combination could cost. He didn't tell Clay to stop talking. He told him what talking cost. If you say it, you carry it. Every word, every prediction, into the ring and through every round. Clay nodded. I understood he kept talking anyway. The press picked it up slowly. At first, it was a novelty. A young fighter with a big mouth and a clean record. Something to fill column space between the championship bouts. Then the tone shifted. Editorials began appearing in sports sections. Words like arrogant. Words like cocky. Words like disrespectful. They wanted humility. They wanted him to let his fists do the talking. To stay quiet until he had earned the right to speak. To wait his turn. To know his place. He didn't stay quiet. Each prediction tightened the pressure. He could feel it in the gym, in the way sparring partners looked at him when he climbed through the ropes, in the way older fighters shook their heads when he passed them on the street. There was a code, an unspoken rule. You respected the sport by staying humble. You respected your opponents by not embarrassing them before the fight even started. You let the record speak. You let the outcome do the work. But Clay had done the math. Humble fighters filled undercard slots in empty arenas. Loud fighters filled seats. Loud fighters made people choose sides, and people who chose sides bought tickets to see if they were right. Still, the risk sat with him at night, alone in the small apartment on the edge of Miami. The adrenaline gone. The noise of the day faded to nothing but the hum of a cheap fan in the window. He would lie flat on his back, hands behind his head, and turn the same question over in his mind. What happens if I lose? Not lose after telling the world I wouldn't, after saying it to reporters, to opponents, to anyone who would listen. A quiet loss could be absorbed, explained away. Bad night, wrong strategy. Forgotten in a week, maybe less, but a loud loss would follow him. It would become the story. He would become the punchline, the fighter who couldn't back up his mouth. He thought about staying silent. He thought about walking it back. Toning it down, playing it safe. He didn't. Because beneath the risk was something heavier. A fear worse than failing. The fear of succeeding in silence and vanishing anyway. He had seen enough to know how that story ended. You won your fights. You collected your purse. You aged out quietly. And then nobody remembered your name. Nobody told your story. You became a line in a record book that nobody ever opened. A ghost in a gymnasium that forgot you the moment you stopped paying rent. So he made a choice. Not once. Every day. Every interview. Every time someone shoved a microphone in his face or a notepad in front of him, he would say it out loud. Before every fight, he would put his name in their mouths before he ever put his gloves up. And if that made him a target, fine. Targets got attention. Attention got remembered. And being remembered was the only thing that lasted after the bruises faded. The backlash grew. Opponents used it as fuel. One fighter told the press that Clay's mouth would get him hurt, that all that talk would make him careless. Another said he couldn't wait to shut him up, to make him eat every word. Promoters loved it. They loved the tension. They loved the way people argued about him in bars and barbershops, at work and at home. Ticket sales climbed. Reporters showed up early to press conferences just to hear what he would say next. The cycle fed itself. The more he talked, the more people wanted to see him fight. The more people wanted to see him fight, the more reason he had to keep talking. But inside the gym, Dundee was watching, not with judgment, with calculation. He didn't lecture Clay about humility or tradition. He didn't moralize. He just made the training harder. Longer rounds on the heavy bag, faster drills on the speed bag, more miles on the road before dawn. The message was clear without being spoken. If you're going to talk, you'd better be ready to back it up with everything you have in tensile. Clay trained like a man trying to outrun his own words. Like the predictions were chasing him and the only way to stay ahead was to move faster, hit harder, think sharper than anyone else in the room. He couldn't afford an off day. Couldn't afford to coast through a sparring session or skip a morning run. Because if he lost, it wouldn't just be a loss. It would be proof that the critics were right, that he was all told that. The mouth was bigger than the skill, and he would rather collapse in training than give them that satisfaction. Some nights he wondered if he had trapped himself, if the predictions had become a cage instead of a weapon, a structure he had built around himself that he could no longer escape. He couldn't stop now. Stopping would look like fear. It would confirm every editorial that called him all talk and no substance. Every opponent who said he would crack under real pressure. So he kept going. Each fight became a test, not just of skill, but of nerve, of whether he could carry the weight of his own voice into the ring and still move the way he needed to. Still think, still adapt, still win. He could. Fight after fight, the predictions held. He said he would win. He won. The gap between the word and the outcome stayed narrow. Tight. Almost uncomfortable in how close it cut. But the pressure never eased. It stacked. Every correct prediction made the next one heavier, because now people expected it. Now they were watching, not to see if he would talk, but to see when he would slip, when the words would finally outrun the fists. The opponents got better, tougher, more experienced. Men who had been fighting longer than he had been predicting. And still, before each fight, he said it. I will win. Not I hope to. Not I think I can. I will. The certainty in those two words was absolute. No hedge. No escape route. Just a statement of fact delivered before the fact had occurred. That certainty, that refusal to leave himself an exit, was the real fight. Not against the man across the ring, against Tao, against the voice that whispered in the quiet hours between training sessions and weigh-ins that one day the words would come true in reverse, that one day he would say it and then lose, and the whole structure would collapse. The persona, the confidence, the carefully constructed belief that he could speak things into existence just by refusing to imagine any other outcome. But he had built something by then that couldn't easily collapse. He had turned himself into a story people followed, not just for the fights, for the spectacle, for the tension of watching a man dare fate every time he opened his mouth. Fans showed up to see if he could keep doing it. Critics showed up to see him fail. Both groups paid the same price for a ticket. Both groups leaned forward in their seats when the bell rang. They wanted to see if he could keep the promise. They wanted to see him proven right or proven wrong. Either way, they couldn't look away. And that was the point. That was the thing he had understood before most people even realized there was something to understand. Cassius Clay had figured out that invisibility was the only loss that mattered. Everything else could be survived, rebuilt. A defeat could be avenged in a rematch. A bad night could be explained with an injury, a bad decision, a better opponent, but disappearing, being forgotten, being another name in the back of a record book that nobody ever opened, that was permanent. That was the real death for a fighter, not the kind that happened in the ring. The kind that happened after, when nobody remembered you had ever been there at all. So he chose noise. He chose risk. He chose to make himself impossible to ignore, even when it would have been easier, safer, smarter to stay quiet and let the wins pile up without commentary. Without prediction, without pressure. Even if it meant carrying a weight most fighters never touched, even if it meant walking into every fight with a target on his back and a prediction hanging over his head like a debt that had to be paid in full, even if it meant that failure, when it came, wouldn't just be a loss on his record, it would be public, loud, unforgiving. A spectacle of its own, because the alternative was silence. And silence, he had learned, was just a slower way to disappear. A quieter kind of erasure that happened, one forgotten fight at a time. He kept talking. The words became part of the preparation, as essential as the roadwork before sunrise, as necessary as the hours spent studying film of opponents he hadn't fought yet. Before a fight, he would sit in the locker room, alone except for the sound of his own breathing, wrapping his hands slowly, methodically. And he would think about what he had said, not to pump himself up, not to manufacture confidence he didn't feel. To remind himself what was at stake, he had drawn the line. Now, he had to cross it. Again. Every single time. And he did. Again and again. Each time a little more certain. Each time a little more willing to bet everything on the outcome, on his ability to turn words into truth through sheer force of will and preparation and refusal to accept any other result. People asked him why he did it. Reporters, other fighters, people in the street who recognized his face from the papers. Why risk the humiliation? Why not just let the record speak for itself? Why put that kind of pressure on yourself when nobody was forcing you to? He never gave them a straight answer. Not because he didn't know, because the real answer wasn't something they wanted to hear. The real answer was that he would rather fail in front of the world than succeed in private and be forgotten the moment he stopped stepping into the ring. That being loud and wrong was still better than being quiet and right, if quiet and right meant disappearing into the background of someone else's highlight reel. So he made himself loud. He made himself unavoidable. He turned every fight into theater and himself into the leading role. And when the bell rang, he made sure the performance matched the preview, because that was the only way it worked. The talking was the setup. The fighting was the proof. One without the other was just noise or just violence. Together, they were something people couldn't look away from. That was what he had figured out in those early days in Miami. Before the poems, before the round predictions, before any of it became spectacle, he figured out that the fight began the moment he opened his mouth, and that if he could win that fight, if he could carry the weight of his own certainty into the ring and come out the other side with it intact, then everything else would follow. He wasn't trying to tempt fate, he was daring himself to become real.